Is it worth paying $100 more for the 10-core GPU option on the M2 MacBook Air? Well, that is exactly what we're gonna find out in this video by testing a bunch of different things, including some benchmarks, some graphics tests, Lightroom classic photo editing, video exporting, Blender rendering as well. And we're gonna see if the 10-core model actually thermal throttles more than the 8-core. Now, before we get into it, I wanna mention that both of these machines are new. We didn't open the bottoms of these. We didn't mess with the logic board, the thermal pads, nothing. And what makes this video special is that both of them are configured exactly the same way except for the GPU. Yes, both of them have 512 gigs of SSD and 16 gigs of RAM, so we're not gonna have any limitations with the single NAND chip on the base storage model or anything else. We have enough RAM to light up those GPU cores, so we're gonna see only the GPU differences between the 8-core and the 10-core. So let's start with the first one, which is of course the classic Geekbench 5 test. And while this is running, I want to mention that we are doing a giveaway of one of our 4 M2 MacBook Air models. Yes, we're going to give it away, and the only thing you have to do to enter is to subscribe to our channel and comment on each of our M2 MacBook Air launch week videos. And the best part is that we're going to pay for the shipping and all the other costs like the import taxes and everything else. Definitely don't get scammed by people trying to get you to pay shipping charges, so comment to enter. And there you go, we have our scores. We have 30,000 compared to 26,353 on the 8-core, so that's about 15% higher score. Now the interesting part is if we look at acetop, look at how much peak wattage the GPUs use. It looks like the 10-core took 13.54 peak watts compared to 10.97. Now that is 23% more peak wattage for 15% more Geekbench score. So maybe that's because it's about Geekbench not being completely optimized. So let's run some more tests. Jump into GFXBench Metal, which is a pretty optimized metal benchmark. Now we're gonna be running the 1440p Aztec Ruins high tier off screen, which is what we prefer over the years. And it looks like they also added a 4K Aztec Ruins test. So we're also gonna run that as well. The test is finished and it looks like the 10-core GPU model is giving us between 21 and 22% better scores in terms of FPS with the 4K test on the top. So I'd actually say that's pretty impressive because if you compare the price points, $1,600 compared to $1,700, that's only about 6% more cash for around 22% better performance, at least in this gaming benchmark. But enough with those synthetic benchmarks, let's actually do a real world test, which is now gonna be a Lightroom classic photo export with 50 42 megapixel raw photos. Now I do wanna show you guys in the preferences that the GPU is now enabled for export, which is a nice new feature for Lightroom Classic. So let's go ahead and export these 50 images. Now, as you guys can see, the GPUs are maxing out in the menu bar right there, and it's using CPU as well, so they're both heating up, and you can see 91 degrees Celsius on the 10-core, so it's heating up faster compared to 87. There you go, the 10-core just finished, and oh, the 8-core just finished right behind it. 1 minute and 10 seconds compared to 1 minute and 15 seconds on the 8-core. So that is a very small difference. Now, what I wanna do is I wanna increase this test to a larger number of photos because it's only 50, so it's very quick. And there you go, I have 300 photos selected on both of them, and let's hit export. And you can pay attention to the GPU clock speed right here. You can see that we're running at around 1300 megahertz on both of them when they're maxed out. Of course, there are some things that happen, so it kind of clocks down every once in a while for the CPU to do some of the tasks. The 8-core just finished, and wow, I am shocked by this result. It's just insane. The 10-core took 12 minutes and 41 seconds. And the 8-core took 12 minutes and 53 seconds. So it is absolutely not worth spending $100 more for the 10-core if you're doing some photo editing that uses GPU like Lightroom Classic. There's almost no difference. Now I definitely want to test Blender for 3D rendering, but before that I want to do a couple of video editing tests in Final Cut Pro to see if it's worth spending the extra money if you are a video editor. So let me first just play them and show you guys the playback. They're both running it perfectly smooth. How much GPU power is actually being used during this test. As we can see, looks like the GPU usage is 51% on this 8-core, And interestingly, about 62%, went down to 58 on the 10 core. Now let's go ahead and export both of these. The test is running, and it looks like in terms of progress, they're both neck and neck, and that is of course because HEVC is using the actual hardware encoders, the media engine to process it. Oh, they both finished at exactly the same time, 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Absolutely zero difference, which means in this test, the 10 core is giving you nothing for basic 4K editing, so do not pay for the 10 core if you're doing stuff like this. And now let's move on to something a little bit different, but actually the same, ProRes RAW. This is a 4K, a 5-minute timeline, and the reason it's the same is because the media engine also supports ProRes on the M2 chip, which is very nice. So let's go ahead and run this, and let's see what differences we get. It looks like both of them are both perfectly smooth. I'm not seeing any drop frames, and in terms of the actual GPU usage, we're looking at around 71 on the 8 core, 74 on the 10 core, which is interesting because I expected more overhead on the 8 core. Oh, look at that, 71 on both. There's really no difference in terms of overhead, which is very interesting. So let's go ahead and export it. And right off the bat, it looks like the 10 core is a little bit faster, and it's definitely heating up over 100. We're looking at 101 degrees Celsius, 102 on the 10 core, wow, compared to 89. Now this test is the best chance for the 10 core to get ahead because ProRes really benefits from extra GPU power. As you can see, they're both maxed out at 100%. And there you go, we have our times. It looks like the 10 core took 1 minute and 40 seconds and the 8 core took 1 minute and 52, so also around 12 seconds slower. Now, even though we have some differences in terms of temps, it's still looking like the 10 core is not worth the $100. So the interesting thing is I did see a little bit of throttling where the 10 core downclocked to around 1250 megahertz compared to almost 1400 on the 8 core, which did not downclock, but this was a pretty short test, so let's do something a little bit longer to see if we can put some more stress and temps into it. This test right here is Canon C200 4K 60 RAW, so it's a little bit more of an intense test, and this is also a 5-minute export. And right off the bat, it is hammering the GPU. We're looking at 102 degrees Celsius on the 10 core compared to 92. That's a 10 degrees Celsius difference so far. And would you look at that, it looks like the 10 core is already downclocking. We just started the test, not even a minute in, it's already at 1320, and it looks like the difference here is that the GPUs are maxed out, as you can see in the menu bar, but we have a heavier load on the CPU. Look at that, 86%, 63% on the CPU. And actually comparing the package power, it looks like 19 watts total package power on the 8 core, 15.4. The 10 core is already thermal throttling. Holy moly, only 3 watts is used on the GPU right now. It is throttling like crazy, only 2 minutes in compared to 6 watts on the 8 core. It's holding up a lot better. Now let me actually grab my thermal camera out and see the actual surface temps of each of these MacBooks. Wow, okay, looking at the 8 core model, looking at 50 degrees Celsius right there on top of the keyboard, 49, going over here, 48. Looks like the 10 core is actually cooler because of how much it's throttling. And this is, guys, 4K 60 RAW. It's not like it's crazy 8K RAW or anything. It's 4K 60, 49 degrees Celsius, compared to 47. It looks like the 10 core is cooling down more. All right, guys, I can't believe it. The 8 core has now taken the lead. This is insane. All right, there we go. They both finished, and this is absolutely insane. The 10 core took 13 minutes and 25 seconds to complete the test, and the 8 core took 13 minutes and 35 seconds to complete this export. 10 seconds faster on the 10 core for $100. So in this case, if you're doing anything that maxes out the GPU, it doesn't rely on the encoders, and it also puts a good CPU load on there as well, this 10 core is gonna throttle, and it's basically gonna kill the performance down to around the same level as the 8 core. It is absolutely not worth it for anybody doing this type of work, and this includes anything like 8K editing as well that doesn't rely on the media engine. So that is disappointing. And with that said, let's go ahead and switch over to something different, 3D rendering in Blender. Here we are in Blender, and the first thing we're gonna do is the classic classroom render. We're just gonna be doing the render image, and we'll see if there's any improvements on the 10 core. And there you go, we finally have a difference. It looks like the 10 core finished this classroom render in 4 minutes and 13 seconds compared to 5 minutes and 25 seconds on the 8 core. And once again, that means that the 10 core is essentially 22% faster. The same results that we got in those other benchmarks in GFXBench. Very interesting. And now getting into the next test, I went ahead and just ran the party tug render using cycles once again, and it looks like the 10 core finished in 4 minutes and 52 seconds compared to 6 minutes and 32 seconds. That's actually a bigger difference. It looks like the 10 core is 25% faster now, which is actually decent. So if you're doing 3D rendering with Blender, it's actually probably worth spending another $100 to get 25% better performance in things like Blender. That's the one area so far in this video where I actually see that it could be worth the 10 core. And now for the final test that I want to run, I want to do something that's more of a gaming workload, which is 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme Stress Test, which basically is going to run 20 minutes of a simulated game and an actual game, because this runs just like a game does. It maxes out the GPU to get as much FPS as possible, while also putting a little bit of load on the CPU as well, because as we know, games also use a little bit of CPU. So let's go ahead and start the stress test, and we're going to see how fast this 10 core throttles, if it does, and see what kind of differences in performance we get. Right off the bat, the 10 core is hammering the GPU. We're looking at 12.5 watts of usage, which is pretty high compared to around 10.96 watts. In terms of the clock speeds, they're both running at 1400 maxed out, or essentially 1398. 100% workload on the GPU, and the 10 core is definitely getting hotter, 97 degrees Celsius compared to 87, so around 10 degrees Celsius difference. Actually 100 degrees Celsius, so about 11 degrees Celsius difference so far. And then looking at the FPS, we're sitting at around 25 right there. Actually, I want to have the same one. Look at that, 32, 37, so around a 5 FPS difference. And look at that, we have 103 degrees Celsius, so already just over a minute or two, we're starting to get really hot temps on the GPU clusters on the 10 core, while the 8 core is still below 100. This is simulating a real gaming workload. And just like that, the 10 core is now using less watts. We're looking at 10.3 watts compared to over 11.5 on the 8 core. And now the 8 core is finally starting to thermal throttle as well, now that it's over 100 degrees Celsius. We're looking at, what is that, 1300 megahertz, while the 10 core is down to 1230 megahertz. So it's thermal throttling more as expected, just like we experienced before. And now with that said, I'm just gonna let this stress test run for the next 15 minutes or so, and then we'll check back and see how everything stabilizes, and we'll see what kind of results we get after this is done. All right, and now that we're around 15 minutes into this stress test, it's interesting, I'm only seeing around 2 to 3 FPS difference between these two models. And the even crazier thing is that the average GPU wattage is now higher on the 8 core model than the 10 core. Look at that, 5.38 compared to about 5.03 watts. And of course, just like before, the clock speed is higher, looking at about 1000, over 1060 to around 900, 950 on the 10 core. All right, and there you go. We finally have our scores, and we have this nice chart showing us the difference with every loop, every score. And the first thing I want to point out is the difference in the best loop score, which is basically the very first test. And looking at the scores, the 10 core got 6742 and the 8 core got 5627. So here in a gaming workload, at the best case scenario, within the very first minute, the 10 core is 20% faster. However, if we look at the lowest loop score, we have 4466 for the 10 core and 4180 for the 8 core, which makes it only 7% faster. So for the worst of the worst, with the most throttling going on, the 10 core ended up being only 7% faster. And we can actually see that in terms of the stability score. You can see that the 10 core stability is only 66.2% compared to 74.3% on the 8 core. So it does show that the 10 core does thermal throttle more, and there's a bigger difference between the best and the worst. But overall, we can tell that the 10 core is still faster throughout all the testing. Now this is only a 20-minute stress test, so most people, if you're actually gonna be doing gaming, you're gonna be gaming for maybe an hour, maybe more. Some people game for hours on end. So the best way to actually test the real difference going forward is to compare the differences between the very last loop, which is loop 20. And right there at the end, it looks like the 10 core was only 5.5% higher in terms of the FPS or the score. So you're basically, for gaming, paying $100 for an extended gaming workload over 20 minutes, you're getting 5.5% more performance, and it's up to you if you think that's worth it. Personally, I think it is not worth it for gaming, especially since this is a metal optimized test, and there are not that many games that are optimized for metal. There are more that actually use Rosetta translation, and it's interesting because Rosetta uses more of the CPU, which is gonna cause more throttling, and according to a video from Greg's Gadgets, he actually got worse performance with the 10-core model in the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, which is a little bit mind-blowing because it thermal throttles more, of course, since it uses more CPU. So overall, I do not think the 10-core is worth it for gaming either. So based on everything, honestly, for paying $100 more, I don't think it's worth it because video editing, barely any difference. Gaming, barely any difference. The only real difference we saw was in Blender, and in reality, if you're someone who does Blender and you actually care about the performance or getting faster times with exports, you're not gonna be buying a MacBook Air. You're at least gonna buy a MacBook Pro with a fan, or even the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, because those are much faster. And even Ian Zelbo, which does a lot of renders for Front Page Tech and his own renders, he himself said that even the M1 Ultra Max Studio did not have enough GPU performance for him for his renders. He's waiting for the Mac Pro. So in reality, I don't think anybody doing Blender or any kind of 3D rendering is gonna be looking at the MacBook Air. So with that said, the final conclusion is this. No, I do not think that anybody should be buying the 10-core GPU model. I don't think it's worth the small improvements that you are getting. So with that said, everybody looking at the M2 MacBook Air should just be sticking to the 8-core, save the $100, put it somewhere else, maybe put it towards an SSD upgrade or more RAM. Do not spend the $100 extra. So there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you learned something new, then comment down below because it's gonna enter you into the giveaway. Don't forget that, and be sure to subscribe as well, which is another requirement. So check out one of those two videos right there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.